The images are shocking. Wildfires rage across vast swathes of land, leaving behind a trail of ash and despair. Cities swelter under record-breaking temperatures, concrete jungles transformed into furnaces. These are not scenes from a dystopian movie. This is the reality of a planet grappling with the increasingly devastating consequences of heat waves. From the scorching streets of Seville to the once temperate landscapes of Siberia, our world is locked in a feverish grip, a crisis fueled by our own inaction. These heat waves, once considered anomalies, are now becoming the norm. Scientists warn that this is just a taste of what's to come if we continue on our current path. The urgency of the situation cannot be overstated. We are at a tipping point, and the choices we make today will determine the fate of our planet for generations to come. This is a call to action, a plea for collective responsibility, and a demand for systemic change. The air we breathe, the water we depend on, the very ecosystems that sustain us, all are under threat. The consequences of inaction are too catastrophic to contemplate. This is not just an environmental crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis, an economic crisis, a crisis that strikes at the very heart of our civilization. We can choose to be passive bystanders, watching in horror as our planet burns. Or we can rise to the challenge, embracing bold solutions and demanding accountability from our leaders.
Heat waves are silent killers. They don't discriminate and they don't negotiate. Their impact is felt most acutely by the most vulnerable among us, the elderly, the poor, and those with pre-existing health conditions. Heat stroke, dehydration, respiratory illnesses, these are just some of the deadly consequences of extreme heat. Hospitals overflow, morgues reach capacity, and the very fabric of communities is strained to its breaking point. The loss of life is staggering, but the human cost extends far beyond the grim statistics. For every life lost, countless more are forever altered. Families are torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and the psychological toll is immeasurable. The scorching heat forces people indoors, isolating them from their communities and disrupting daily life. Schools are closed, businesses shuttered, and entire cities grind to a halt. The homeless, with nowhere to escape the relentless sun, face a daily struggle for survival.
The economic consequences of heat waves are equally devastating. As temperatures rise, so too do the costs. Crop yields plummet, leading to food shortages and soaring prices. Infrastructure crumbles under the relentless heat, disrupting transportation, communication, and access to essential services. Businesses are forced to close, productivity plummets, and supply chains are thrown into disarray. The tourism industry, once a lifeline for many communities, withers under the scorching sun. The global economy, already reeling from multiple shocks, faces an unprecedented challenge. The financial burden of adapting to a hotter world is immense, and it is the poorest and most vulnerable countries that are hit hardest. Developing nations, lacking the resources to cope with the escalating impacts of climate change, face a vicious cycle of poverty and instability. The gap between the rich and the poor widens, fueling social unrest and geopolitical tensions.
The science is unequivocal. The Earth's climate is changing at an unprecedented rate, and human activity is the primary driver of this change. The burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas releases massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, trapping heat and warming the planet. The consequences of this warming are already being felt around the world. Heat waves are becoming more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting. Sea levels are rising, glaciers are melting, and extreme weather events such as hurricanes, floods, and droughts are becoming more common. The scientific community has been sounding the alarm for decades, warning of the dire consequences of inaction. Yet for too long, their warnings have been ignored by those in power. We can no longer afford to ignore the science.
In the face of this global crisis, the international community has begun to mobilize, albeit slowly and with much resistance. International conferences, such as the United Nations Climate Change Conferences, COP, have become crucial platforms for world leaders, scientists, activists, and policymakers to come together to discuss solutions and chart a path forward. These conferences, While often fraught with political maneuvering and hampered by the influence of powerful vested interests, represent a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. They offer a space for dialogue, collaboration, and the forging of international agreements aimed at curbing greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating the impacts of climate change. The landmark Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015, was a watershed moment in the global fight against climate change. For the first time, nearly every country in the world came together to commit to reducing their emissions and working towards a future where global temperature rise is limited to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement, despite its limitations, remains a beacon of hope in the fight against climate change. It represents a recognition by the international community of the severity of the crisis and the need for collective action. The agreement provides a framework for cooperation, transparency, and accountability, and it sends a clear signal to the world that the era of fossil fuels is coming to an end. One of the key elements of the Paris Agreement is the concept of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. Each country is required to submit its own plan for reducing emissions, with the aim of collectively achieving the global temperature goal. These plans are reviewed and updated every 5 years, with the expectation that they will become increasingly ambitious over time. The Paris Agreement also includes provisions for financial and technological support to developing countries, recognizing that they are disproportionately affected by climate change and often lack the resources to adapt. Developed countries have pledged to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries, although this target has yet to be met.
While international agreements like the Paris Agreement provide a crucial framework for global action, technological innovation will play a critical role in our efforts to combat climate change. Fortunately, there is a growing wave of innovation in the renewable energy sector, with solar and wind power becoming increasingly affordable and efficient. Advances in battery storage technology are making it possible to store renewable energy for use when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Electric vehicles are becoming more prevalent, offering a cleaner alternative to gas-guzzling cars. Energy efficiency improvements are reducing energy consumption in buildings, appliances, and industrial processes. Beyond renewable energy, there is a growing field of research and development focused on carbon capture and storage technologies, which aim to capture carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and other industrial sources and store them underground, preventing them from entering the atmosphere.
While international agreements and technological innovations are essential, the fight against climate change ultimately begins with each of us. We must all take responsibility for our own carbon footprints and make changes to our daily lives to reduce our impact on the planet. Simple actions such as reducing our reliance on cars, using energy-efficient appliances, and consuming less meat can collectively make a significant difference. We can also choose to support businesses and organizations that are committed to sustainability and environmental responsibility. Beyond individual actions, we must also use our voices and our collective power to demand change from our elected officials and hold corporations accountable for their environmental practices. We can support organizations working to address climate change, participate in peaceful protests and demonstrations, and vote for candidates who prioritize climate action. By working together, we can create a groundswell of support for climate action and build a more just and sustainable future for all.
We stand at a crossroads. The path we choose today will determine the fate of our planet for generations to come. We can continue down the current path of inaction and denial, condemning ourselves and future generations to a world ravaged by climate change. Or we can choose a different path, a path of courage, compassion, and collective action. The challenges we face are immense, but they are not insurmountable. We have the knowledge, the technology, and the resources to address this crisis. What we need now is the political will, the collective determination, and the unwavering belief that a better future is possible. The fight against climate change is not just about saving the planet, it is about saving ourselves. The time for action is now.